Welcome to my channel where I say there are only two types of conservatives, the selfish and the stupid. At the end of this video, I'm going to tell you what kind I think Vivek Ramaswamy is. I might drop a few hints on the way. Is he selfish or stupid? Wait to find out.
All right, so make your pitch. Why you instead of the guy that was there last time, Donald Trump?
So I see the rest of the GOP field. They are running from something. I am the person in this race who is leading us to something.
That statement is just a bunch of babble that doesn't have any real meaning to it.
To our vision of what it actually means to be an American. We're in the middle of a national identity crisis in our country. Faith, patriotism, hard work, family. These things have disappeared.
Where does he get the idea that families have disappeared in this country? I have a family. Lots of people in this country have families. I think what he's trying to say is the type of families that he likes are on the decline. He likes the Leave It to Beaver type families. Families where a kid has two moms or two dads probably doesn't count to him because he just doesn't like it. How can he say that patriotism and hard work have disappeared? I'm a truck driver. I work as hard as I can. And I'm also a patriot. I love my country. And he also acts like faith is some great noble virtue. Remember that, because I'm going to use that against him later in this video.
And I think I'm the candidate in this race who's actually offering an affirmative vision as opposed to just saying that we're not doing what the left is doing. No, individual, family, nation, God. These are the things that ground us. I think we should talk about them in the open, and I think that's why we're having success early on.
Okay, I'll talk about it in the open. I don't even know what the hell he means by saying nation, family, God. That's what grounds us. What does that even mean?
Vivek, there's been some discussions in recent days around your book about January 6th, especially given concurrent potential pending indictments against the former president. Let's go ahead and put this up there on the screen. In your book, you wrote, quote, "The loser of the last election refused to concede the race and claimed the election was stolen, raised hundreds of millions of dollars from loyal supporters, is considering running for executive office again." I'm referring to Donald Trump. Do you still believe that Trump actually lost the election and that January 6th was a dark day for democracy?
I was in detail in both of my books and articles, and I've been very consistent about this throughout. I have seen no evidence. It's exactly what I said in Nation of Victims, and I haven't seen the evidence since, that there was a scale of ballot fraud that would have changed the outcome of the 2020 presidential election.
Now he has said something that is very reasonable and I can agree with.
I've also said in that same book and ever since that the real way the election was, in a narrow sense, stolen was the suppression of the Hunter Biden laptop story.
That's possible. As far as I'm concerned, Trump should have never been president to begin with because we, the people, didn't pick him.
So one reason that we're asking some of these questions is because we are expecting indictments with regard to January 6th for President Trump as soon as today, but potentially this week. You've said in the past that you would pardon former President Trump if you are yourself elected president of the United States. I mean, is that hard and fast, or is your mind open to change if there was some new evidence that was presented that you aren't aware of, or are you just, you're locked in, you're going to pardon him, and it really doesn't matter what comes out?
No, I'm data-driven. On the first two indictments, I read them completely before making my statement that I would pardon Trump both for the most recent documents case, which for reasons I've laid out elsewhere, we can go into it, I think is absolutely politically motivated, is absolutely a national disaster if this proceeds to a conviction. I think it was a disaster that it proceeded to an indictment. Yes, I would pardon him for that. And I would also pardon him for the New York case. And yes, I know, state law, federal law. I've made an argument on the pages of the Wall Street Journal as to why the president can pardon him for that crime as well. Based on what I know, I would absolutely pardon him for the alleged offenses underlying a potential January 6th indictment. I think that would be a national disaster as well, potentially even more dangerous than the other two because of Section 3 of the 14th Amendment. This one could actually disqualify him from holding office. And I say this as somebody who's now polling third in the Republican field. It would be easier for me if Donald Trump were not in this race. But that is not the way I want to win this election. I think that we should not become a country where the party in power uses police force to indict and eliminate its political opposition.
So
I guess I could see it as a possibility that police force is being used against Trump to eliminate him as a candidate. Very unlikely. But even if he's right, the whole purpose of a jury trial is to act as a safeguard to prevent that from happening. If all these people on the jury find him to be guilty, then what right do you have to pardon him of these crimes? And with all the jury members he's going to be facing, it's hard for me to imagine there's not going to be at least a few Trump supporters on it.
Not the way we do things in this country.
I want to get clarity on your position. So
Yes.
on the documents case in particular, first of all, I want to ask you, given what we know, and he deserves his day in court, et cetera, but looks pretty clear. He held on to a bunch of very classified material. When he started getting calls from the government and from law enforcement saying, hey, we know you've got some things. Will you cooperate with us? According to what's been presented so far, it looks like not only did he not cooperate, that he, moved some boxes around and tried to conceal exactly what he had. Don't you think that a private citizen that engaged in those types of activities, wouldn't they also be indicted and probably given a lot less grace and a lot fewer second chances than former President Trump was in this instance?
So I track the facts against the law. And one critical feature, Crystal, is that this was the former president of the United States, and there is a statute that covers former presidents of the United States and how they relate to both classified and unclassified documents. That's the Presidential Records Act. That came after the act under which he was indicted, which I think is one of the most un-American statutes, the Espionage Act. And I wrote an extensive piece in the Wall Street Journal about why I would repeal that act. It's been abused for most of our national history.
Remember this part about him saying the Espionage Act has been abused. I'm going to use that against him later.
I think it was abused here. So the Presidential Records Act makes clear what access a president of the United States has to at least unclassified documents. On the theory that he's being prosecuted against, actually the Espionage Act does not distinguish between classified or unclassified documents.
Correct.
Which means that there's a strong legal argument that the Presidential Records Act supersedes the Espionage Act as it relates to presidents who who deal with classified or unclassified documents.
So then let Trump's lawyers make this argument to the jury and let them decide if you're right or not.
This was a bad judgment.
Describing Trump's actions of taking classified documents out of the White House that has to do with nuclear weapons, calling that bad judgment really disgusts me. As far as I'm concerned, it's treason. I don't know if it meets the legal definition of treason, but it should.
And when you talk about people who are concerned with climate, you call them climatists, you call them climate cultists. Let's just put some of these news stories up on the screen here. You've got record high temperatures that are causing increasing death in Arizona. You've got workers who are dying from heat exhaustion. You've got people who are being choked by wildfire smoke from Canada. You've got an entire state of Florida that's basically uninsurable at this point. And the American people are living this reality increasingly at this point, and an overwhelming majority of them, some 2/3, say, yeah, this is a concern for me. So do you have the sort of contempt in your heart for them that comes out in that language when you would describe them as climate cultists?
I have no contempt in my heart, Crystal. I have deep sympathy for people who are hungry for purpose and meaning and have relocated their desire for faith to the faith in climate instead.
Remember what I said earlier when he was making out like faith was some great noble virtue that we should be proud of? Well, apparently if you have faith that climate change is going to be a real problem, now it's a bad thing. Basically what he's saying is that it's good to believe by faith as long as we believe what he believes by faith.
Instead,
But why
I
shouldn't?
believe in facts.
But
I believe in
what's
facts.
wrong with this?
So we can talk.
Now he's saying he bases his beliefs on facts. But earlier, he acted like faith was some great noble virtue. Either you're going to base your belief on the facts or you're going to base your belief on faith. Pick one. My concern about climate change has nothing to do with needing a deeper purpose in my life. It has to do with the fact that I have listened to scientists say that climate change is going to be a serious problem. Now, I know there are some scientists who say it's not going to be a serious problem, but I see no point in taking a chance. But for argument's sake, let's say the climate skeptics are right. We should all still want to reduce carbon emissions just so we can have cleaner air to breathe.
So let's talk data. Let's talk data.
Let's talk data. I've got some
If you're
data
open
that
to
I can put
talking
up on
data.
this.
Like I said before, if this guy was really driven by the data and facts, he would not have been talking about faith like it was some noble virtue. The problem when guys like him talk about the data and facts is that they can go through and cherry pick the facts and data that support their position and ignore all the facts that disprove their position. No one should care about his opinion about climate change because he's not a scientist. He's a businessman.
For you, Vivek, is on Mexico. You've talked and shared a lot of the critique that we've had here on Ukraine about the military-industrial complex, about pursuing things that are not of our strategic interest. But you've talked on your website about using the military to annihilate Mexican drug cartels. I know previously you had at least rhetorically opened yourself up to an invasion. So, I mean, what are you going to send America's sons and daughters into Mexican territory? What military resources are you going to use? Are we going to declare war on Mexico? How is this all going to work?
No, we're not going to declare war on Mexico. My top objective is to get Mexico to take care of its own problems. Sagar, there is a fundamental difference between what's happening with the drug cartels in Ukraine. What's happening in Ukraine does not affect the lives of Americans here on American soil. What's happening with the Mexican drug cartels in Mexico does. So that's just a fundamental difference. But even against that backdrop, absolutely, I don't want to. Declaring war on Mexico would be a boneheaded idea.
You
I'm not
do
going to do
say
it. So here's what I would do.
On your website, though, on your website, you do say, use our military to annihilate Mexican drug cartels. So what does that entail?
And the Mexican drug cartels are as much of a threat to the sovereignty of Mexico as they are to the United States. They're more of a threat to the sovereignty of Mexico. So here's what I would do. I've said that I would use, here's what I would commit to doing. Use our military to secure our own southern border. The wall has been insufficient. Cartel-financed tunnels built now underneath that wall. Trucks can drive through them. And then I would work with Mexico diplomatically to say that, listen up, for a tiny fraction of the amount we've already spent in Ukraine as of this date, we can help you solve your own problem and regain your sovereignty. There's a presidential election in Mexico. I think it's an important one in 2024 as well. Thankfully, AMLO is going to be out. Hopefully, new leadership embraces not the hugs, not bullets strategy that he has. I think that's been a mistake. I want to actually help Mexico solve its own problem because that will help us. But as a backstop, if they don't solve the problem, then we're going to have to solve our own problem. And that's the way I expect this to end. Mexico will solve its own problem.
Wait, but what does that mean?
Stand up with a spy.
What does that mean? Are we talking about drone strikes on cartels in Mexico? Are we talking about cruise missiles? Are we talking about boots on the ground? If Mexico says we're not working with you,
it means we have military on our own border, and there are a series of steps we can take. Turn off foreign aid of any kind to Mexico or Central America until our border crisis is solved. There's a series of steps to take, and I'm convinced that we will never get to the place of actually having to use war of any kind in Mexico. But at the same time, we have to demonstrate our strength to make sure that Mexico is taking care of its problem in a way that AMLO is absolutely not doing based on the posture that Biden's taking with respect to them.
I just want to get a really clear answer. Is there any scenario under which you would use the U.S. military against Mexico's wishes to go into their country and drop bombs, drone strike, or whatever cartels?
I will not rule out that we would. I would not rule out that we have to use that we may treat Mexican drug cartels in the way we treated ISIS, as terrorists in another country that are posing real risk to Americans. And the risk to Americans is even greater from the Mexican drug cartels than it was from ISIS. That's what I'll say.
He saves the stupidest stuff for last. He thinks declaring war against Mexico is a boneheaded move, but committing acts of war against Mexico is still on the table with him. These military strikes against Mexico, is he going to just call those a police action? This really reminds me of the Vietnam War and the Korean War. We didn't declare war against these countries. We just went over there to kill communists. He's basically just saying in a very nice way that he's going to use our military to try to intimidate Mexico into doing what he wants them to do. It's not like the United States has never used its military against drug cartels before. We thought that if we could just kill Pablo Escobar, all the cocaine production and trade would stop immediately, and no one in this country would be able to get cocaine. And I guess they thought that then we would live in a utopian paradise with sunshine and rainbows. But in reality, all that happened was other people who were in poverty took his place. Whenever we kill a drug cartel member or bust a drug dealer, it does nothing to the supply of illegal drugs into our country. That's because there's a hell of a lot of people living in poverty that'll be more than happy to take their place. Aren't we told the definition of insanity is to do the same thing over and over again, expecting a different result? Yet this is exactly what he wants to do. He just wants to step it up even more. And whenever our military does anything, there are always innocent civilians who get killed. And what is the purpose of doing this anyway? Is it to protect our health? These acts of war that he's talking about committing against Mexico and the entire war on drugs and having drugs illegal has caused more violence, harm, and death than if they just legalized drugs and let drug users have fun. Do you remember what he said about the Espionage Act being abused? Well, guess what else has been abused? Our drug laws. Richard Nixon did not like the hippies protesting the Vietnam War. They were just, exercising their First Amendment right of freedom of speech. But he knew they were doing drugs, so he used our drug laws to persecute them. Black people are a hell of a lot more likely to be persecuted for doing drugs than white people, even though white people do them just as much. Another example of our drug laws being abused. So it's now time to answer the question, is he a stupid Republican or a selfish one? I give him 10% being selfish and 90% of being stupid.